There is a particular kind of silence that only makes sense once you understand what usually fills the space instead. For Ricky Gervais, that space is almost always occupied by something loud. A punchline, a provocation, a stage full of Hollywood's most powerful people sitting in uncomfortable silence while he tells them exactly what he thinks of them. He has spent more than 4 decades being the person in the room who refuses to soften anything. So when, in the spring of 2026, he went quiet, when the commentary stopped and the timeline went still, it told people something. Not because he announced it. Because of what the quiet was protecting. What it was protecting was Jane Fallon. The woman he has shared a life with since 1982, since before either of them had any reason to believe their lives would amount to much of anything. The woman who has built her own substantial career on her own name without ever needing his. And the woman who, in early 2026, told the public, in her own words, on her own terms, in a single Instagram post, that she had been diagnosed with breast cancer. This is not a story about a man who became famous and acquired, somewhere along the way, a devoted partner to stand beside him at award shows. It is closer to the opposite. It is the story of 2 broke 20-somethings who found each other first, who built 2 entirely separate careers side by side over more than 40 years, and who are now, in their mid-60s, finding out together what it means to face something neither of them can control. This is the story of how 2 people built something that lasted, long before either of them had a reason to think it would. Ricky Dean Gervais was born on June 25, 1961, in Reading, Berkshire, the youngest of 4 children. His father worked as a laborer, having emigrated from Canada, and his mother, Eva, held the household together through the kind of steady, unglamorous effort that doesn't get written about until decades later, when her son becomes famous enough that people start asking where he came from. Eva had hopes for her youngest. She wanted a scientist in the family, and she made her case the way mothers often do, not with a lecture, but with a gift. She handed him a biology textbook, thick and serious, the kind of book that announces an expectation simply by existing. Ricky took one look at it, considered his options, and informed her that he intended to become a pop star instead. His mother, unimpressed, told him that being a pop star was really just another way of describing a drug addict. It was the kind of blunt, working-class wit that he would later spend a career trying to replicate on stage, not realizing he had been raised by someone who already had it. He enrolled at University College London in 1980, technically to study biology, a decision that lasted roughly 2 weeks before he abandoned it for philosophy, a subject with considerably less obligation to anything practical. Before that, he had spent a year working as a gardener at the University of Reading, not out of any grand design, but because 18-year-olds with no plan often take whatever job is in front of them while they wait to discover what they're actually for. At UCL, he found his way into music, co-founding a synth-pop duo called Siona Dancing. They signed a deal with a real label. They released 2 singles. The first peaked at number 117 on the charts. The second did slightly better, climbing to 79, which in the music industry is still a polite way of saying nobody bought it. The label dropped them within the year. Gervais would later describe his entire career as a recording artist as lasting exactly 12 months. A tidy, self-deprecating summary of a dream that simply didn't take. He tried management next, taking on a fledgling band called Suede in their earliest days. He worked with them for a stretch, then stepped back, telling them he could no longer manage the group. Suede went on, shortly after, to become one of the defining British bands of the 1990s. Gervais has noted the irony without any apparent bitterness, that his exit seemed to coincide rather precisely with their rise. It is the kind of detail he tells on himself now, the way someone tells a joke they've long since made peace with. It would become a familiar pattern across the first half of his working life. Close to something promising, gone before it paid off, watching from a distance as it became exactly what he'd once hoped to be part of. By his late 20s, none of it had worked out into anything resembling a career. He took an administrative job at a London entertainment company, working behind a desk in the management office, filing paperwork, doing the ordinary unglamorous work that keeps an industry running without ever letting him near the parts of it he actually wanted. He stayed there into his 30s. There was no clear sign, at that point, that anything was about to change. He had met Jane Fallon 2 years earlier, in 1982, during their final year at UCL. She was studying history. He was failing, charmingly, to become a pop star. The exact circumstances of how they first started talking have been recounted slightly differently across the decades of interviews both have given, which is usually a sign that the meeting itself wasn't dramatic, just the beginning of something that became significant only in hindsight. By the time they graduated, they were a couple. 2 years after that, in 1984, they moved in together. Their first home was a single room above what Gervais has described, with characteristic bluntness, as some kind of seedy sauna in London's King's Cross, a neighborhood that, in the mid-1980s, bore little resemblance to the polished, redeveloped district it is today. The room held a bed and a fridge, positioned closely enough that Gervais has joked he could reach the fridge without leaving the bed. He recounts it now not with embarrassment, but with the specific fondness people reserve for the years when they had almost nothing and somehow it was enough anyway. While Gervais spent his 20s and into his 30s drifting between failed bands, failed management gigs, and an office job that led nowhere, Jane Fallon was quietly building something real. She became a script editor, then a television producer, working on major British productions including EastEnders and the influential 1990s drama This Life, which captured a generation of young adult viewers in a way few shows of that era managed. She built her career on her own judgment, under her own name, with no connection to who she happened to be dating. For 2 decades, she was simply Jane Fallon, working producer. Not anyone's girlfriend, not anyone's plus one. What is consistent across the years of interviews Gervais has given is this: Jane was the one who told him, long before anyone else thought to, that he was actually funny. Not in the polite, encouraging way people say things to keep a partner's spirits up. In the way someone says it after years of close observation, when they've watched every failed attempt and still come away convinced there's something they're worth waiting for. In the late 1990s, in his late 30s, Gervais took a job behind the scenes at XFM, a London alternative radio station. He has said plainly that he had no idea what he was doing when he started. He learned the job as he went, and in doing so built a radio show unlike most of what was on British airwaves at the time. Loose, observational, prone to long tangents, built on the kind of honest noticing that made listeners feel like they were overhearing something real rather than consuming something polished and produced. It was, in retrospect, the first place the public version of Ricky Gervais, the one people would eventually recognize everywhere, started to take shape. Stephen Merchant was working in production at the same station, and the two struck up a partnership that would change both of their lives. They kept circling back to a particular kind of comedy, the slow-burn tragedy of office life, the specific awkwardness of a manager who believes himself to be well-liked and charismatic while everyone around him quietly disagrees. In 1998, they recorded a test tape, a rough pre-pilot, built around a character named David Brent, a middle manager at a paper company in Slough whose desperate need for approval was obvious to everyone except himself. Gervais played Brent with a precision that suggested deep familiarity, because it was. He had spent years inside exactly these kinds of offices, watching exactly these kinds of people. Brent wasn't invented from nothing. He was assembled, piece by piece, from years of quiet observation in rooms Gervais had never wanted to be in. The BBC eventually commissioned the show, and The Office premiered in 2001. The early audience research numbers were, by most accounts, dismal, among the lowest the network had recorded for a new program in years, reportedly outperformed by little besides women's lawn bowls coverage. There were real conversations inside the BBC about whether commissioning the show had been a mistake. Gervais, by his own account, didn't panic. He has explained the reason plainly in interviews over the years. He was 40 years old, and he hadn't spent his 20s and 30s desperately chasing television stardom. He'd spent those years failing at other things entirely, watching Jane build a serious, credible career of her own while he kept searching for whatever his version of that would be. When the BBC delivered the bad numbers, he didn't experience the kind of fear that comes from a person who needs this one thing to work. That absence of desperation, he has suggested, is part of what let The Office stay exactly as uncomfortable and honest as it needed to be, without anyone smoothing its edges to make it more palatable. The show found its audience slowly, then completely. By 2004, it had won the Golden Globe for Best Television Series, sold to dozens of countries, and inspired an American adaptation that would go on to run for 9 seasons and become one of the most successful sitcoms in U.S. television history. Gervais accepted that Golden Globe at 42 years old, for a show that had once tested worse than lawn bowls. Jane was there for it. She has been present, by his account, at nearly every major moment since, not as an accessory to his career, but as the person whose judgment he has said he trusts above anyone else's. He has described her, across multiple interviews over the years, as smarter than him, as funnier than him in person, as the one person whose honest opinion he actually wants before deciding whether something he's made is any good. What followed The Office was a long stretch in which Gervais largely did whatever he wanted creatively, a freedom he secured early by insisting, as a first-time television creator with no leverage to speak of, on co-writing, co-directing, and co-producing his own show. The BBC was reportedly surprised by the demand. He has said the reason he could make it stick wasn't confidence in negotiation. It was that he genuinely didn't mind if the answer was no. He has described the lesson he took from that period simply. He wanted to own his own work, and that mattered more to him than almost anything else. From there came a run of shows that varied wildly in tone but shared a clear authorial signature. Extras, which mixed comedy with a deepening vein of melancholy. Derek, in which he played a character of such uncomplicated, guileless kindness that it surprised people who only knew him from his more combative public persona. Afterlife, a Netflix series about a grieving local newspaper journalist who responds to losing his wife by deciding he has nothing left to lose and nothing left to be polite about. A show that became one of Netflix's most-watched British productions, and one that Gervais has said moved him to tears on the first take of nearly every emotional scene. He has spoken candidly, in interviews tied to that show, about his own deepest fear, not of failure or criticism, both of which he has weathered plenty of, but of ending up like Tony, the character he plays, a man left behind after losing the one person his entire life was organized around. He has gone so far as to say that the version of devotion shown in flashback throughout that series, a married couple who never stopped finding each other funny, who built private jokes the way other couples build savings accounts, was drawn directly from his own life with Fallon. His long-held belief about comedy, repeated across interviews for years, is that it is fundamentally rooted in empathy, that laughing at something is, more often than not, a sign you already understand what the right thing to do would have been. He hosted the Golden Globes 5 times, using the platform on each occasion to say things to a room full of powerful people that they would rather not have heard said publicly, and rarely, if ever, apologizing afterward. He has said plainly that chasing popularity is, in his view, one of the worst things an artist can aim for, that if it happens, but reaching for it directly tends to ruin the work. While Gervais was building that body of work, Jane Fallon was undergoing her own reinvention. Around 2006, after 2 decades in television, she decided to step away from producing and try her hand at fiction instead. The following year brought her debut novel, Getting Rid of Matthew, a comedy about the messy aftermath of falling for a married man, and it became a national bestseller almost immediately. It was the kind of first novel success that looks effortless from the outside and rarely is. She kept going from there, building one of the more durable second careers in modern British publishing. Got You Back followed, then Foursome, The Ugly Sister, Skeletons, Strictly Between Us, My Sweet Revenge, Faking Friends, Tell Me a Secret, Queen Bee, Worst Idea Ever, Just Got Real, Oversharing, and most recently Welcome to the Neighborhood, released in January 2026. Across more than a dozen novels, her books have sold in excess of 2 million copies in the UK alone and been translated into more than 20 languages. Sharp, twisty, often very funny stories about envy, betrayal, friendship, and the small lies people tell each other to get through ordinary life. Critics have repeatedly praised her instinct for plotting and her ear for dialogue, the same instincts, perhaps, that once made her so reliable a judge of other people's material. Her fiction has had a life well beyond the page. Got You Back, her 2008 novel about 2 women joining forces against the man who betrayed them both, was adapted into Joyride, a jukebox musical built around songs by the Swedish pop duo Roxette, which premiered at the Malmö Opera in Sweden in 2024 to sold-out houses. Her debut, Getting Rid of Matthew, has been in development as a film for several years, with a cast that includes Luke Wilson, Heather Graham, and Emma Roberts, nearly 2 decades after the novel itself first found its readers. In 2020, University College London, the school where she and Gervais first met as students with no money and no plan, awarded her an honorary fellowship, a formal acknowledgement that she had become something substantial entirely on her own terms, in the same institution where their story began. It is a small, neat detail. The place that brought them together is also the place that, decades later, recognized her achievements as entirely her own. Across more than 4 decades together, Gervais and Fallon have never married, and the explanation both have given, repeated consistently over many years of interviews, has never wavered much. Fallon has said plainly that neither of them is particularly bothered by the formality, that if either of them had truly cared about having a wedding, they likely would have had one by now, but it simply never felt necessary. Gervais has put it his own way over the years, describing their relationship as a marriage in every sense except the ceremony itself. Shared finances, shared everything, a life built jointly for decades, with no real argument, in his view, for why a certificate would change any of it. He has gone further still in some interviews, suggesting that without a shared religious belief, the idea of a wedding before God struck him as somewhat beside the point, that their unofficial arrangement had, by his own count, already outlasted plenty of marriages that came with the paperwork.